Hey all, welcome to Hit the Apex podcast. I'm Jawad as always. Thank you for joining me. How are we doing today, guys? Or this week, I should say. Hope you're all well and enjoying enjoying yourselves. Had a bit of a blank there. Happens from time to time. Anyway, this week or today, this week on the podcast, wanted to look at the situation down under. Kind of. Mostly it's to do with Supercars because last week we got confirmation of a return to race date, which is set for June the 27th. We're going to get back racing in the Supercars Championship, and there was quite a bit to take away from that. So I'm like, okay, let's do pretty much a whole podcast on that. So last week, we talked mostly F1 with all the silly season updates and big moves and everything. I did write an article that got published today actually about Fernando Alonso and all the chat around him, so you can go over to the Raw, check that one out. But let's focus on Supercars and what's going on down under here. More of in a broad sense, I guess. We had the first wave of our restrictions lifted across the country, each state doing it to how they want it or how they see fit, which, got no problem with at all. I've always said I've said all along that here in Australia compared to other countries, even New Zealand, that it hasn't been as strict. And now there's this air of, we've gotten over it. We've gotten over it. Not the case, because we're heading into winter. I felt it this week, actually, the cold. It's been, when it gets into your bones, it's like, oh, damn it. You know that you're in for a rough one over the winter, but yeah, there's going to be a second wave, and it's just no time to get complacent or anything like that. Not unless you're a, liberal redneck who decided to go and protest a couple of weeks ago at Parliament House here in Melbourne against the restrictions. They were chanting "Sack Bill Gates." I mean, what's Bill Gates got to do with it? And all the stuff on social media, which have been following for the last 2 weeks, about dictator Dan, referring to our Premier Daniel Andrews. I mean, if this is a dictatorship, then got it pretty easy. Got to say, got it pretty easy. So, no, it's just it's just rubbish that I'm sure that the Liberal Party and people who follow them are trying to kick up a fuss and everything. I think Victoria have done quite a good job as far as managing this has been concerned, with the restrictions and everything. Some of the restrictions, of course, have been lifted, with people being able to visit each other at their homes, up to 5 people and whatnot, and if there's up to 10 people you can gather in public. So it's kind of great because, a lot of people obviously get a bit down, being isolated and everything, but by no means this is over. So still got to be cautious and everything. The sack Bill Gates thing still cracks me up. I think that's why I had to bring it up. And that it's just the one demographic, or the one, if you're talking political in a political sense, it's the they vote for a particular party. So let's not go too far into that. We're not a political podcast. Except for when it comes to motorsport and racing. And we had some good news last week as far as the Supercars Championship is concerned. We've been enjoying the E-Series and all that, but it kind of reaches its limit a little bit. You kind of want the real thing back, and we will. June 27 is the date that we're going to get back into the championship at Eastern Creek, Sydney Motorsport Park. So they released an 11-event calendar, which should meet the minimum requirements, or for the broadcasters, of course, with their contractual obligations. We're meant to have 12 events as a minimum. So with Adelaide, the Adelaide 500 still counting, of course, with the championship points, which means Scott McLaughlin is still the leader. The rest of the calendar, this is how it looks. So we go from Eastern Creek to Winton here in Victoria, then up to north to Darwin, of course, and Northern Territory have been the first state to completely lift restrictions, I think. Or you can go to the pub there, that's all I know. And that's pretty big. You can go to the pub there in the Northern Territory. Then off to Townsville, which is an interesting one. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. The Bend, of course, there. Bathurst 1000 keeps its traditional date in October, which is fairly important too. Then going over to Perth, Symmons Plains, Tasmania, Sandown, which will be the final event of the calendar year. And then in the new year, we go across the ditch to New Zealand. It's undecided yet whether it will be at Pukekohe or Hampton Downs, as they were supposed to do it this year over Anzac Day weekend. And then Bathurst, again, a sprint round at Bathurst scheduled for the 5th of February to 7th of February. Same weekend as the Bathurst 12-hour. I'm going to give this topic a little bit of time on its own a bit later, so bear with me. But yeah, you look at the events that didn't make the cut, unfortunately. Newcastle, Gold Coast, unfortunately, are off due to viability. That's because they're street circuits and in densely populated cities or towns or whatever, Newcastle. Yeah, you could say Newcastle is a city. Sorry, Newcastle people. I would love to come and visit one day. It seems pretty cool for the Supercars. Newcastle, Gold Coast cut due to viability. Unfortunately, they're not able to do it, set up the street circuits this year. Townsville, though, you might say, well, Townsville is a street circuit. Why is it on the calendar? Well, from what I've heard, 70 or 80% of the Reid Park facility is actually permanent, where you only need a small portion of it to run onto the actual streets. So you've got the permanent pit facility there, you've got, most of the infrastructure's already there. You only have to set up, 20 or 30% of it on the actual streets, which, they've agreed to do. They've said that they're going to... It'll run without a crowd if it has to, because we've still got restrictions on, mass gatherings, of course. And at the moment, you would say that crowds are definitely out of the picture. We just want to get the racing back up and running with all the essential crew members and staff that they need to run the event. And of course, you can watch it on TV, which with motorsport, you can say that I guess it doesn't make much of a difference if there is no crowd. We see some races where grandstands are empty anyway, and it doesn't really take away from what's on the track. It's more so, your ball sports or your stadium sports where it gets a bit funny when there's no crowds. I mean, any game at ANZ Stadium, if you watch rugby league at ANZ Stadium, there's basically no one there, and it doesn't really matter because they still have a good game to come from that. So crowds still very much, I guess, out of the picture. I guess there's been talk about Darwin potentially being the first race to welcome crowds. It would all be locals, of course, who because interstate travel is still out of the picture, you can't go there. I guess, it's up to Supercars to get special permission to travel into these states, or if, unless they lift the restrictions completely. Now, both Victoria and Queensland are the states that house all the teams, except for Brad Jones Racing, who are in Albury. They're the exception. But yeah, they're going to all have to be given special permission to be able to travel in and out, unless you're in Victoria, because there's no border restrictions there. But for the Queensland team, certainly to be able to be given permission to leave and then come back, of course. And when you look at all the venues too, they're all great facilities for being like a little hub or like an isolation hub or whatever. Eastern Creek, I won't say it's remote because it is still kind of in a populated part of Western Sydney, but it is remote enough that, you're not going to have people from the outside being able to come. Winton, of course, few hundred k's out of Melbourne, just near a town called Benalla. Darwin as well, obviously, with their lack of restrictions that they've got there, is fine. And then, places like the Bend, Bathurst, Barbagallo, they're all kind of like away from the main cities, so they should be fine. And hopefully by the time we get to somewhere like Barbagallo later in the year and Symonds Plains, Tasmania, there is a lot less restrictions. But that all, you can't predict that, and that's what I got to stress continuously, that yes, I'm excited that we're potentially going to get some racing back, but it all depends on safety and also whether the conditions change here. As I said, second wave in Australia too, so potentially events, kind of on the eastern side of the country, where we are, Melbourne, Sydney, those kind of places, it does get pretty cold over the winter, and they're going to have to kind of avoid that. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of factors still, but ultimately they've come up with a plan, which is great. It seems like it's viable, feasible as well, meeting the minimal contractual obligations and making sure that, sponsors and everything get their exposure, and also just making sure that the staff and everything, staff and everyone involved with Supercars are getting paid and, their families looked after and everything. Unfortunately, we've already had a casualty as a result of this pandemic because, not, health-wise, but a team, being forced to withdraw from the season. That's 23 Red Racing, one of the top teams, you could say, on the grid. Their sponsor, Milwaukee Tools, unfortunately has been unable to continue on as, title sponsor for the Phil Monday operation with Will Davison, and they've unfortunately had to pull the plug because there's no one else to fill that void. They were a strong car, which is the big shame of it, and Phil Monday, very passionate about his racing, so those guys unfortunately have had to bow out, and that's as a result of this pandemic and the lack of business that is going around. So that's the unfortunate reality from a business point of view. Of course, without the product, or without the racing, or without the play, these people don't get paid, kind of thing, and they're thinking about it from how do we put food on our tables for our families and that sort of stuff. And I think this is where it's important that, they come up with a plan to get back to doing what they do, exercise strict, biosecurity measures and everything, and make sure that everyone's safe. It's a safe environment for them to do so. Like, there's a lot, I guess, with sport compared to, say, retail, for example, there's a lot of factors that you can, that are different between the two. With sport, as they've talked about, you create a hub, an isolation hub, where everyone involved with putting on the event, or, involved with putting on the game, they can all stay together and, in and out, and not have any contact with any outside forces. Whereas with something like retail or hospitality, there's a lot of external factors, of course, because your business depends on it, face-to-face, or, P2P, customer-to-customer, or customer-to-salesperson kind of interaction and everything. So with sport, I guess it seems like it would be a lot safer. There's a lot less variables, but then it all depends on the people involved staying isolated too, and not, going out and doing anything that might get everyone into trouble or jeopardize the entire product. So that's that. Formats yet to be decided upon, of course, as well. You'd think, or they have said, that everything except Bathurst, the 1000, of course, at this stage will be a 2-day event, so they're going to keep it all compressed. I guess you can have your normal super sprint format across those 2 days with the 2 races that they have normally. Enduro Cup, unfortunately, or is it unfortunate? We don't know yet. It may not be the Enduro Cup that we know. Now, we heard from the guys at the Bend Motorsport Park yesterday saying that they're still firm on hosting the pre-Bathurst Enduro, the 500k race that they were due to do this year for the first time, taking over from Sandown. Bathurst 1000, of course, stays there. But then when you look at the calendar, after Bathurst, we go to Perth instead of the Gold Coast. So, can we hold an Enduro race at Perth? Maybe. Well, you can hold an enduro race anywhere, but whether it'd be good is is another question. So that's where I think, they're going to have to decide. Like, CEO Sean Seamer hasn't totally ruled it out yet, so there's plenty of planning still going on behind the scenes. But it would be great if we could get an Enduro Cup as always. If not, then you've got to understand that nothing is going to be normal this year that we're used to. So, the closest to normality, it's good that everyone's trying their best to make things as normal as possible, but the reality is that unfortunately it's not going to be fully normal this year. So, yeah, if we get that Enduro at the Bend, that would be great. Even if it's not counting towards an Enduro Cup or anything, at least we get that pre-Bathurst Enduro race to get all the co-drivers and everything ready to be able to go for the main race at Bathurst. So that's exciting. Already mentioned Darwin, that they could be the first event to have crowds. They were talking potentially about Winton opening up the campgrounds for basically minimum spectators and everything, spread them out or whatever, because of course a circuit is, racetrack is huge, you've got a lot of space, and if you if they open up the limit on mass gatherings, if you allow a few hundred people, even 1,000 people, spread them out over the racetrack, it could be possible, but I would not recommend it at this point. I would say, look, for now, let's just watch it on TV. I'd say if you were to get crowds in for an event, maybe the Bend and Bathurst, they would be the first to look at, but it all just depends on what the situation is throughout the country and what the restrictions look like. One person who's not in the country at the moment, Shane Van Gisbergen, well, he's going to need special permission to return to Australia before the the restart of the championship. He's in New Zealand at the moment, so we saw that the New Zealand Warriors for the rugby league were able to get special permission from Border Control to be able to fly in on a chartered flight to Australia and then quarantine themselves up in Tamworth. So I see no reason why Van Gisbergen wouldn't be allowed. It's just him. He's returning to Australia. One person, put him on a chartered flight, get him quarantined for 14 days, of course, before we have that June 27 restart. And yeah, basically then he won't be able to go back home until whenever, when the restrictions are lifted, which it's been great that they're talking, both governments are talking about, opening up a trans-Tasman bubble potentially, where people between Australia and New Zealand might be able to travel, but, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So, but yeah, potentially something for the future to look at, because, of course, we've got Supercars heading over to New Zealand early next year. Still plenty of time, but there is still plenty that can go wrong as well, which it's important to remember that, because this thing is still, there's no cure, there's no vaccine or whatever. So yeah, very important to keep that in mind. Quickly going back to the news of 23 Red and them not being able to continue on this season. Big shame, I got to say, because they looked really strong in the first round this year, and then even the practice sessions that we had, or qualifyings that we had at Albert Park for the Melbourne 400. So yeah, you'd hope that Davison is able to land a co-drive hopefully this year for Bathurst or the Enduros, if they do the Enduros. What we've seen is that the team members at Tickford who operate on that 23 Mustang, they've had their jobs saved by Boost Mobile and James Courtney, so they've ended up coming in and taking up that vacancy that Phil Munday and Will Davison have left. So James Courtney, without actually having missed a race this year, because of course he had that controversial split with Team Sydney, with Techno, after the first round in Adelaide. So he ends up finally joining Tickford, because after his championship win in 2010 at Dick Johnson, he was being lobbied to join up what was then FPR, same team out in Campbellfield here, Victoria. Joined those guys. Then he ended up going to HRT, the old racing team, and then the rest is history. So he finally gets to join that outfit, back in a Ford for James Courtney, and I'm sure he'll be a valued addition to the grid, but at the same time, losing a guy like Will Davison, losing a guy like Phil Munday, it's going to hit a few people hard. So that's that. Davison yet could be a co-driver at Tickford, of course. We've got some not news, but you can kind of put two and two together regarding one of their co-drivers, who is Alex Premer. I mean, I forgot that Premer actually got kicked out of DJR Team Penske after he won Bathurst last year with McLaughlin, and Tickford Racing were the guys who swooped in and took him on. Premer, of course, he lives in Las Vegas in the United States, and if the international travel restrictions are still in place, which we know that they are going to be by October, then Premer will not be able to travel here to Australia. So Davison could take Premer's place potentially. So that's one silver lining, but of course it is still pretty sad that, they've had to bow out completely. Hopefully for the next season they can organise something. That would be great. They've still got a racing entitlements contract up their sleeve, so they could technically still come back, hopefully, you'd say. So that's that. Bathurst, not the 1000, of course, the 12-hour, February 5th to 7th, and yes, I'm booked to go. Hopefully mass gatherings are allowed, or even a select crowd is allowed to go, and I'll definitely put my hand up to be a part of it. So what the controversy, and I don't know why it's a controversy, but it's been made a controversy, so let's talk about it. So Supercars have scheduled their final race of their 2020 season there at the 12-hour in 2021. It's important to know that Supercars, or Supercars events, the organisation, the entity, the almighty, owns the Bathurst 12-hour event. It's got the rights to it, and as part of their contract with the New South Wales government, they're required to host the final race or the final event of the season in New South Wales. Now, typically that's Newcastle. Unfortunately, Newcastle is not going ahead. So they've only got options, Sydney Motorsport Park and Bathurst. So why would, if you've chosen that February date, why do it at Sydney Motorsport Park when you own the event for the Bathurst 12-hour? Let's combine the two and have two events in one. So for any lover of motorsport, for any petrolhead, this is like a smorgasbord, you'd think. But also, I guess it's a fail-safe to protect the 12-hour event in case international travel is still restricted in February. So giving you a bit of background and shedding some light on this, the bulk of the GT3 teams and drivers, of course, who contest the 12-hour every year come from overseas. Now, unfortunately, there's not enough local GT competitors or GT3 competitors to fill the roster viably to have a 12-hour race. The event is just too big now, as we've seen over the last few years, the growth of it, that there's not enough local entries here to be able to fill up a grid or a roster to be able to race a 12-hour on the Sunday, February the 7th. So, as a fail-safe, let's have the Supercars there, because in case we can't get the 12-hour teams and drivers over, we still have Supercars that can fill the roster or whatever, have their sprint races there, maybe come up with something creative as they've talked about potentially. Of course, that's not final. It depends on what happens with the 12-hour. So this is not part of some conspiracy, in inverted commas, that some people have talked about, that Supercars is trying to push out the GT3 race. It's simply a fail-safe to protect the event in case the 12-hour as we know it doesn't go ahead. If they do both go ahead as planned, it would be a fan's wet dream. It would be, yes, I've said it. Because I know I'd love it if we get to see Supercars as an undercard to the one of the biggest GT3 races on the calendar. As far as making sure it's not boring, if it had to be just Supercars there, well, compared to the 1000, well, obviously it's going to be a sprint race, but compared to the 1000, which is in October, conditions are going to be totally different. It's usually like 40 degrees that weekend, anywhere between 35 and 40 degrees across the whole weekend. So that's going to be a big variable, tyre wear and everything. Bathurst is pretty demanding on that sort of stuff. So it's going to be a different competition anyway, or a different challenge, I should say, than the 1000. So, anyone should be excited about the possibility of having a second event for Supercars at Bathurst. It's one of those things, and finishing your championship there too, given the the extraordinary circumstances that we've undergone this year, it would be the perfect conclusion. And then of course, the turnaround to starting season 2021 as well, which at the moment you'd hope will kick off in its traditional spot in March. You'd say it would be early March this time for the Adelaide 500. So that's that. There's no conspiracy to it, none that I'm aware of, apart from the ones that people are making up, of course. Probably the same people standing outside Parliament House with "Sack Bill Gates" on their placards. That still cracks me up. It's just people, what are they doing? So, I'm not against it. I've said it here. I'm excited that potentially I'll be going there to see it, and it's going to be a good product. So hopefully, barring any other catastrophes that happen, we're going to get Supercars back on the 27th of June, and it's going to be great. I love it. Now, I said I was going to keep it very local, bit of Australian flavour. Well, there always is anyway on this podcast. But let's talk about the footy, because there's been more information, of course, and AFL, they've announced their restart date to be June 11, which for all the AFL fans, all the footy fans out there, really exciting. They're going to have a 3-week mini pre-season, of course, to get everyone back into shape and get ready for the new season to start, or not new season, continuation of the season that had already started. So we had news, of course, that the teams in South Australia and Western Australia are going to have to relocate to Queensland, given that they've still got restrictions and stuff in place that would, or South Australia in particular, that would not allow training to occur. But at the same time, it's going to keep the competition in 3 states, which you can fly in and out of pretty easily: Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales. It's a good thing that they haven't, gone and released the draw or anything just yet. That all depends on what's going on, and also for the teams, such as your West Coast Freo and then your 2 teams in Adelaide, the possibility of them being able to have home games in their home states later in the year too. So it's all, they're doing a good job by just playing it by the ear, making sure that they don't jump the gun on anything, but also making their intention to get back to playing very clear. And as I've talked about many times on the podcast, that this will be just to fulfill, broadcast obligations and get that revenue going for the stakeholders, which importantly for the staff, for the team members, for the players as well. Without playing or without any competition, there is no pay, and they need that to support their families and everything in these tough times. So they've laid out their plan. The AFL, the NRL have got their own plan too, as I've talked about. May 28, which is less than a week away now. So, if I record next Thursday, for example, or next Friday, for example, let's say Friday, it'll be after the first game that'll be played since the break that they've had. So after all the hurdles that they've gone through, now they've got this referee controversy as well. Ever since they said that they're going to go back to one ref, the ref unions have gone on strike or something. I don't know, something's going on with those guys. It'll be just good for them to get the product back on the road and for some footy to be played. As I've said before, both codes have outlined clear return to play plans. They've got their biosecurity measures, and safety is the number one thing that is in everyone's minds. So let's see how it all plays out. I mean, NRL, they've got a couple of weeks of competition before we get, AFL come back as well. So, the AFL will be keeping an eye on them and seeing how it all goes. At the moment with the rugby league teams, I think if you're playing in another state then or in another city, you're going to have to drive in, drive out, or fly in, fly out before and after the game, so there's no hanging around. They did that earlier in the year anyway when we went to games behind closed doors for round 2, and then they released the venues as well, so there'll be several teams playing out of a couple of venues in New South Wales, so Campbelltown Stadium and Bankwest Stadium out in Parramatta, but then you've got teams such as my Cowboys who get the benefit of playing at home at their Townsville Stadium. Broncos as well in Brisbane, they get to play at Suncorp, and then Melbourne will play down here at Amy Park as well. So some teams, I guess, get an advantage of home stadium, some teams won't. Unfortunately, like the Canberra Raiders, who will be based out of Campbelltown, or they'll have to travel to Campbelltown every time they've got a home game. But doesn't make much of a difference given that there's no crowds anyway, and it's the crowds that make the atmosphere. Who knows? We'll find out next week when they get back. And yeah, the exciting part of it is that we get to see them play again. We get something on our screens, TV screens or wherever you're watching on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday to watch. A bit of normality for everyone, but it's not about that. It's about what I said before, making sure that they can play safely, everything is conducted in a safe manner, and then begin the revenue stream. Make sure that these people are looked after, from a business point of view. Because without it, what do you do? So many people without jobs at the moment, and if anything, as I've said before, it'll start, making the economy tick over and potentially create new jobs for the people who don't have work at the moment. So it's good of them to do this. Really exciting. I know I'm already looking at Supercoach again, trying to organise my team for when we do get restarted. It's really good that State of Origin now, speaking of Supercoach, State of Origin is going to be after the grand final at the end of the season. There's not going to be any buys either in the middle of the year, so you can just load up your Supercoach team with whoever you want without worrying about Origin break or buys. Of course, you've still got to come under the salary cap, but it means I can, have all those Origin stars. I might have to trade out David Fafita, who's injured at the moment, get in maybe Jake Trbojevic, get in James Tedesco if you don't have him, Kalen Ponga, all those guys. So yeah, really exciting, to get that back on track. Crowds, of course, with the games still far away, as I said, with the Supercars. I wouldn't even broach the idea of fans anytime soon, and the possibility of even having a final series without fans either. That's a thing that I think could be very possible as well. Let's just not risk it at the moment. Let's just keep all the teams and players and everyone in their bubbles. Watch it on TV, watch it from the safety of your home. If they reopen pubs, maybe you can go to the pub and watch it. I don't know, but the whole mass gatherings, big crowds are still a bit terrifying to me at this point. Even to the point where slowly now, because, as I've said, I'm back at work 3 days a week now doing online stuff without any customers in the shop. It's completely closed. But, seeing more and more people jump back on the trains and public transport, it's, it's like, okay, just keep up the distancing, guys. Don't get too close. Don't sit in the same next to me. Don't sit in the same booth as me. Just keep your distance, all right? Because this thing is far from over. But slowly, we're all adapting to living at the moment in this current climate or this current predicament, and for the most part, people are doing really well. And once we get sports back, I'm sure, because sports are part of our culture, sports are part of, everything that Australians celebrate as well, there might be a bit of normality there. But the new norm will be, watching it from home, not going to the pub, not going to the ground. But at the same time, by us watching it on TV, we're helping them get their product back up and running, help start generating their revenue to make sure that everyone that they need to look after are looked after, and potentially in turn it has the effect of creating jobs and all that sort of stuff for everyone else. So that's that, I mean, unless you want to go protest again and try and get Bill Gates sacked, we're doing okay. Like, just don't be stupid. Don't be a knucklehead. And hopefully these things can come back slowly, and hopefully they don't get derailed. But if they do, it's not like we didn't predict it, given that we're going into winter and everything. So, and that's where I think the footy codes might, be not be in trouble, but there might be potential trouble because they can't all go up into the hotter climate and play. I'm glad that they're not playing in Canberra with the NRL, because that place it snows sometimes when they play, so that would not be good at all. But play Sydney, even down here in Melbourne, it does get pretty chilly. So just saying, I'd rather be at home, rugged up, heater on and everything, enjoying a nice glass of scotch like Michael Jordan did in that documentary, with his glass there, his cigar just sitting there. If you haven't watched The Last Dance yet, please get onto it. It's fantastic. I just finished it last night, the final episode, and what a great series, and such great insight into that dynasty. And when you do your reading and you learning about it, it's funny that, the Bulls ever since have not won another championship, so that was clearly the Bulls, their dynasty, their time and everything. So great program, get onto it. What else am I watching at the moment? Gone back to watching Peaky Blinders, of course. I did a little spell with Westworld. I've got to now watch season 3, but I wanted to take a break, go back to Peaky Blinders, and that's been great. Other than that, that's it, I think. Keeping it local. Remember, there's the article that I wrote, you can check out on The Raw, for Fernando Alonso, why he, basically if he's not winning, he should not come back to F1. If he's not in a winning car, that is nothing against his own ability. He can win no matter what, but he needs the car to be able to win. So check that out. Other than that, have a good weekend, guys. Take care. Next week, of course, plenty to talk about as always. Looking forward to some rugby league as well, and I guess an opportunity for anyone who is dying to watch sport all over the world. Check out this thing called the NRL. Some people describe it as cross-country wrestling, but it's good fun. Except for when the players do stupid things off the field and bring the whole game into disrepute. That part is not fun. And you kind of have to question their intelligence a little bit at times. But on the whole, it's pretty good. So, take care, guys. Have a good weekend. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at @HitTheApexMedia. Get in touch. And I'll be back next week. Ciao.